From here to the stars, I am your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb is a research assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Texas Tech University. Our guest today is Dr. Joseph Gottlieb. Thank you, Doctor, for taking the time for the interview.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Let me read a brief bio, a summary of your bio. Dr. Gottlieb is a research assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy at Texas Tech University. His primary research is in the philosophy of mind, focusing on the nature of consciousness and perception, with additional interest in cognitive science, applied ethics, and the history of early modern philosophy. Outside of this, he has focused on existential risks, the moral status of artificial intelligence, how best to positively influence the long-term future, and space expansion and settlement. Doctor, I am a board member of the Lifeboat Foundation, which is dedicated to reducing the likelihood of human extinction. I view human expansion into space as vital to the survival of our species. I feel we should do this at the very least within our solar system and preferably beyond our solar system. I also see other benefits to space colonization, of course, for our species to learn and grow and prosper. But as a matter of survival, it is a necessity. Do you share this view, either in part or entirely?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think the answer depends on the kind of risks we think we face, the risks we think to our long-term survival. So I would certainly disagree that space colonization is a sufficient condition for our long-term survival. What I mean by that is I don't think it's enough. We can't simply colonizing space wouldn't be enough. But I am inclined to think that is at least a necessary condition, in the sense that if we are to survive for the long term, then we must colonize space. Now, where things get especially tricky is what happens when we do colonize space, because of course, space is not exactly an innocuous atmosphere. And there might be other kinds of threats to our long-term survival that would not have occurred if we did not colonize space. So I don't think the issue is, I don't think it is obvious that it is necessary for our survival, although I am inclined to think it probably is. But there are hosts of questions that come up regarding just how well this sort of project would take, how well this project would go, that are relevant to our survival, and not just our survival, but also our flourishing. But yes, I think to put it as quickly as possible, I would say I am inclined towards the view that it is at least a necessary condition on our long term.
Okay.
But that leaves open a lot of issues.
Why are the goals of the Interstellar Research Group important to you personally?
I think that that preserving humanity, right? So there's a few questions we ask. We should say, well, one, what do we need to do to preserve humanity? Okay, and then another question is whether we should preserve humanity, whether surviving for the long term is something we should care about, right? And I think the answer to the normative question, that second question, is a resounding yes. So the reason I care about organizations like this is that insofar as they care about this goal too, and insofar as they are thinking about things that might help us realize this goal, right? And of course, interstellar travel and interstellar colonization would, given our earlier question, right, is at least a necessary condition. Then I'm on board in that respect, right? So, I am in favor of doing anything we can to reduce existential risks to human civilization, and not just human civilization, of course, like any sentient creatures, right? Any creatures that are moral patients, right? So, insofar as the goals of organizations like these are, even if only tangentially related to that, I am on board, and I think the work that's being done is important.
Les Johnson tells me that you have written a chapter for a book he is editing. I've read the chapter. Your chapter analyzes in great detail the ethics of the question, should we colonize space? And by colonize space, of course, it means creating self-sustaining space colonies, at first within our own solar system and eventually outside of our solar system. At the end of the chapter, you list a number of arguments against space colonization that have been put forth by other ethics researchers. I'd like you to give your rebuttal to each of them. The first one is malefic geopolitics. Space colonization will create new opportunities for increasingly violent war.
I don't endorse the claim that space colonization would not create these opportunities. Rather, my position is that we need to weigh the positives and the negatives, taking into account these facts, right? So there's certainly, right, so these sorts of scenarios where we think of, space colonization creating vast more amounts of violence than we would have had otherwise, right? Even if that's true, that itself doesn't settle whether we should colonize space, right? You can't just look at that and say, well, okay, then we should not colonize space. Rather, that claim needs to be understood relative to the benefits of colonizing space, that colonizing space might bring. Now, with respect to maleficent geopolitics or issues like that, I think one of the, clearly, right, one of the main drivers of these things is the fact that space is so big, and it makes solving collective action problems and creating cosmic leviathans very difficult. So I actually want to grant to proponents of this sort of view that I think there's a sense in which, in fact, they're right. But that, again, that itself, right, that itself isn't enough, isn't sufficient to say that, well, now we shouldn't colonize space. Rather, again, my point is that we need a framework for thinking about, right, all the different variables, right, that we care about when trying to make momentous decisions like these, right? And you can't just look at any one consideration, right, and say, well, at least in practice, it doesn't work that way. So yeah, I'm afraid that, like, so you asked me to rebut it. I can't. It's not. But actually, I don't think that's a problem per se, because rather the issue is much more nuanced than this. And I would say that I suspect that the authors and the different ethicists and political theorists who put forth this view, they're probably aware of that. But I think what I am trying to do in the paper, I actually, as you probably noticed, so the titular question is, should we colonize space, right? Specifically, including interstellar space. Actually, question. What I'm more interested in is thinking about what other questions we need to answer in order to answer that question. And many of those questions aren't things you can decide conceptually or a priori. Rather, they're empirical questions, like, the correlation between different existential risks, right? So, like, right, you might think, for instance, that suppose it's true that there is this worry about maleficent geopolitics or the increase of violent war caused by space colonization. Well, right, how do we weigh that against the fact that there are portions of our existential risk landscape that are entirely uncorrelated? So let me tell you what I mean. So consider asteroid strikes, right? So being hit by an asteroid or nuclear war, or for example, these are existential risks in the sense that they can either permanently foreclose future value or literally cause our extinction. Now, on its face, certainly so in the case of asteroid strikes, that's a risk that's uncorrelated across different settlements. So, like, by that I mean, if an asteroid strikes Earth, there's no reason to ipso facto think it's going to strike Mars or wherever else we have a settlement, right? So, like, if you care about protecting our civilization, then maleficent geopolitics aside, right, you still have a reason to colonize space, right? So yeah, I don't have a rebuttal, because in fact, I don't think it's in need of rebuttal per se, because there's a sense in which, I mean, again, it's not implausible that these things would happen, but again, you have to compare them against the relative options, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. It would produce an increase in the possibility of danger.
Sure.
But it, again, like you said,
but so does anything.
Yeah,
for that matter, right?
Yeah, the future will hold more dangers. whether we go to space or not. It'll have a little maybe
Right.
more danger if we go to space, but that doesn't preclude the idea that we should go to space.
Right. No, it doesn't. And I think too, right, like, right, so we have on the one hand, we have trying to reduce extinction threats, but then we have this, what I call suffering risk, which is not my own terminology, it's common parlance in this area. But then we have this worry that colonizing space will increase suffering risks. But the very issues, right, that cause us to think that maybe colonizing space would increase suffering risks, like the fact that space is so big and we wouldn't be able to have these cosmic leviathans or these governing bodies. It cuts in the other direction too, because the mere fact that it is so big makes conflict in a way more difficult, right? Because people, you know, you have more time to, you know, just to give you a silly example, not silly, but, you know, if someone were to somehow figure out how to shoot a nuclear warhead from Mars to Europa, from a settlement on Mars to settlement in Europa, there's a lot more time to evade that than if you were, you know, entirely Earth-based, right? So those chronic distances, right, that cut in one direction also cut in the other direction. Mm-hmm. So my aim here is to provide a framework for thinking about these critical issues. Now, if you were to ask me, like, and I mentioned this too, right? So if you're saying, well, what future do you find most exciting? Then I can answer that very, very easily. It's the future in which we colonize space. Mm-hmm. That thrills me, but that's not a moral question, right? So
I may have been overreaching in the word use of the word rebuttal.
Fair. No, I just want to. Yeah, I don't want to give you hope that I can give you a thing like that. I just don't think.
Okay, yeah. But I would like you to address each of these objections.
Sure.
Number 2, natural threat amplification. Space colonization will exacerbate natural existential risks.
So this is like the asteroid worry, right? So like, because you have the high grounds, you know, so authors like Duedny and Torres, they say, well, look, this is like the perfect vantage point from which, you know, a competitor civilization on Mars or something can bombard Earth, say, with asteroids. So again, I think the thrust of my response is essentially similar to the one I gave in the early one. It's just that, so technically, yes, it does make it true. Yes, that's true. But also, right, it's also the case that space colonization would make asteroid deflection easier, right? It's not to say that you can't have any asteroid deflection. I mean, we already have efforts to do this. So in the paper, I mentioned the DART program, right? So we might imagine, right, an asteroid deflection system that is dispersed throughout the solar system, but presumably you would only be able to have that with at least some kind of colonization infrastructure. So again, it's not to say that this isn't true, right? I mean, like, it almost follows trivially that by virtue of having space colonization, you have the ability to, you know, launch asteroid bombs, or not have it immediately, but it increases that chance, right? Just because you actually have the high ground now, right? Whereas before you didn't have the high ground. So I think in some sense, right, again, it's not to deny that this is the case. It's rather that, right, you need to think about that issue embedded within the context of the general reason of why we wanted to colonize space to begin with, right? And you have to weigh up those positives and negatives, right? Mm-hmm. And then your ultimate assessment depends on not just empirical assumptions, but also normative assumptions too, right? Like how much you in fact value the long-term future of the civilization, or how you weigh suffering versus pleasure, right? Or just how you weigh normative goods versus normative bads. I don't think, you know, I don't think these things can be answered in a vacuum. But again, right, with respect to the specific thing about natural threat amplification, it's true, yes. By colonizing space, we have opportunities to launch asteroids on on Earth that we wouldn't otherwise have. But right, there's also benefits, right, to asteroid deflection as well. Now, I should say too, as I'm thinking about this, it's actually interesting. There's a sense in which that sort of worry, like natural threat amplification, specifically like asteroid bombardment, it actually isn't so much an argument against space colonization, because notice, you could have that worry without a space colonization in my sense, that is large scale, self-sustaining space colonization. You could have natural threat amplification without that kind of large scale infrastructure. Just imagine, and we have projects like this, right, where people are trying to corral asteroids to get to extract, high value minerals, right? Which I actually think could be a benefit, right, too. But notice, right, you might have a malevolent actor who, just imagine some kind of scenario, a malevolent actor who, is working in this sort of asteroid mining company, and they stick a propulsion system on the back of an asteroid, right? So notice it's actually not an objection to space colonization per se, right? And that's revealing because, right, unless the proponent of this objection is willing to also say that we shouldn't even do any kind of space exploration or resource capture in the solar system, unless they're also willing to say that, right, then the objection doesn't actually. So now it's funny. You asked this question, and now I'm saying, well, I was going to throw them a bone, but now I'm thinking actually the worry is actually even more misplaced than I thought but originally. But unless they're willing to say that, then the objection, and I suspect that it's sort of absurd to say, look, not only should we not colonize space in this large scale sense that I'm discussing, but we should also not even attempt to, do resource capture from the solar system or any of these other things, right? Which could themselves very well cause that natural threat amplification. So yeah. You asked me this question. I started out being somewhat sympathetic and just saying the issue's nuanced, and now I think maybe not so much. So maybe I should add that to the paper. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's still in process. I mean, it's still.
Yeah, you're right. It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Number 3, restraint reversal. Space colonization will exacerbate anthropogenic existential risks via contributing to various forms of deregulation. In that sort of case, the kind of specific example I thought of as potentially germane is threats from artificial superintelligence. So I imagine, right, that a proponent of this sort of objection would be saying something like this, right? Well, okay, so we have this emerging technology that has these potential great benefits, but it's also potentially very dangerous, right? Now, because of legal constraints, right, we dampen down that risk when it's Earth-based. But if you were to say have a colony in the outer solar system away from legal strictures, then right, the risk is amplified. I guess my response to that is I have more sympathy, I think, for the other sort of risks of space colonization than I do for that one, because I seem to think, especially in this case of artificial superintelligence, I don't think there's any like, so is it possible? It's possible, but I don't think there's any reason to think it's especially likely, certainly because we already, artificial superintelligence is actually one of those existential threats that truly is correlated across settlements. So like, people already know that actually study this, know that if there's a threat from artificial superintelligence, space colonization will be of no help. I feel pretty confident about that. So like, they know this threat, and them experimenting on it far off away, right? They're already well aware of the kind of danger inherent to it. So like, it just doesn't seem to me antecedently plausible. Again, possible, yes, but plausible that this sort of thing would occur.
Yeah, I just think insofar as it's a problem, it probably carries fairly low weight relative to the other sort of concerns, like maleficent geopolitics and these are and like alien generation, those sorts of things. I think relative to them, it's probably a smaller issue.
Let's see, number 4, hierarchy enablement. Space colonization will exacerbate the risk of totalitarian rule.
Yeah, so I suspect with that sort of scenario, the worry is just something like, well, initial space colonies are extremely inhospitable, right? No one's going for a walk in the park. 1, because there's no parks, and 2, if you're going to go for a walk, it's going to be in a spacesuit, right? So they're inhospitable environments to begin with, and because of that, right, there has to be strict rules. Now, I think part of the problem here is that we have this conception of freedom and this conception of moral rights that is born out of a world where, at least people in developed nations want for very little, at least on average, right? Of course, there's inequities and there's all sorts of issues. So I think in this sort of case, the concern is, the objection is predicated on the assumption that our moral values in a, what we might call affluent society, right, carry over to a spaceborne society. And I just think 1, that's a substantive assumption, which may well be false. And 2, I just think it's flatly unrealistic. So, right, like it just might be that, and likely will be, that there are certain freedoms that would be curtailed, right? In at least in the initial stages of a space colony. But notice, right, we need to be careful how we phrase that, because saying, okay, well, you have this freedoms curtailed, that has an immediate negative connotation. But the negative connotation is only justified against the backdrop of what our freedoms actually should be. And I think that there's a sense in which, right, that is to some extent context dependent. And we're blind to this, I think, because so much of our moral theorizing has been done against the backdrop of an affluent society, right? If you think about most moral philosophers, right, and especially in Anglophone philosophy, it's done against the background of an affluent society. And I don't know how realistic that is. So there's a philosopher named Tim Mulligan who wrote an entire book on this. I'm slightly embarrassed, I'm blanking on the title. I think it's called Ethics for a Broken World, where he asks us to hypothetically imagine Earth where it's not affluent in the sense I'm talking about, but where we are ravaged by climate change, right? People look back and they study the works of moral philosophers in the 20th and 21st century. And their minds are blown by the presumptions we make, right? Because they're highly context dependent. So I think, look, right, like to some extent, the hierarchy enablement issues, yes, like they're gonna happen just by necessity. Now the question is, once we develop things more, right, and we start perhaps pursuing terraforming and things like that, maybe there's no reason to think that they would still hold, right? Because the context has changed. But that doesn't mean in the initial stages where it does have this sort of totalitarian flavor, therefore that we can make this normative assessment. Because I think like the moral assumptions we take for granted are to some extent dependent on the affluent context in which we live. I just don't think it's realistic.
Okay. Number 5, alien generation. Space colonization will exacerbate extinction risk due to species radiation and extreme cultural and ideological diversification, creating, and it quotes, aliens in both literal and figurative sense.
Right, yeah. I mean, again, it's one of those scenarios where, so you have this phylogenetic drift. So one of the things I like to think about here, I suspect maybe you're familiar with the series, The Expanse and the books. Yeah. So in that series, they have the belters, which, so they live in the asteroid belt. And because of this, right, they're very tall due to gravity issues and whatnot. And they just, structurally they look human, but they look very different. But more importantly, they have, in a sense, different value, not completely alien values, but there is something of what I've called value drift. So I certainly think that, again, is it a concern? It's a concern in the sense that, yes, this not only could happen, but probably would happen over the extremely long term. Now, I don't think it's an immediate concern because these things don't happen overnight, obviously. And even in the Expand series, I think they happen. I think it is science fiction, of course, so they're allowed some creative license. So it's probably unrealistic how quickly it happens in that series, because that's only, I can't remember exactly how far in the future it takes, but maybe like 150 years, 200 years. So I think, again, we want to grant the point that it is technically true that, right, there is this possibility that there will be drift in this way. But see, it's a further question whether the drift would in fact be bad, right? Because so here's one way you can have a drift. You can have a drift in value systems where their value system looks different from ours. But notice, looking different doesn't entail that there is conflict, right? So it's a further step to actually claim that the value drift would be such that we would have some kind of conflict. It doesn't, there's no strict entailment there. And in fact, not only would I say that there's not an obvious entailment, there's no entailment, I don't even think it's obvious that there's even a likelihood that the drift would be of a kind that creates conflict, right? So just like, I can have two propositions, P and not P. There's conflict there in the straightforward sense that they're logically contradictory, right? But suppose my value set is encapsulated by P, whatever that stands for, and there's another set that's encapsulated by Q, right? They're independent streams, but that doesn't mean that they conflict with one another. So I think this sort of consideration is how shall I put this kindly? It has a lacuna in it, in the sense that there's a hole in the argument that is highly substantive, which without that hole, it doesn't have any bite, right? So what I'd be willing to grant is that there would be drift, both just in sort of obvious physical appearance over the very long term, and there would probably be some kind of value drift. But it's a further step, right, to say that the value systems would be such that we would have more likely conflict. Okay. And I don't see any independent reason, any reason built into this, I should say, rather, that makes that the case.
That was Dr. Joseph Gottlieb. This has been From Here to the Stars, a video series produced by the Interstellar Research Group. The IRG is a non-profit organization dedicated to thoroughly exploring the science and engineering that can eventually open up the reality of interstellar travel. Find out more about our next symposium at irg.space. I have been your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and you can subscribe to our channel for other such videos. On behalf of all of us here at the Interstellar Research Group, I thank you.